I still remember the first summer it happened, as if it were burned into my memory. My mother's voice had that overly sweet tone, the kind she used when she was trying to soften a blow. "Honey, I'm so sorry, but there just isn't enough room." You know how Olivia's family is. 4 kids, plus Mark, it gets crowded. You understand, don't you? I remember holding the phone in my hand, staring at the wall of my small kitchen in Raleigh, North Carolina. My 2 children, Julia and Ethan, were sitting at the table coloring quietly. They looked up at me with hopeful faces, waiting to hear if we'd be heading to the beach house this year. I didn't have the heart to tell them we were left out again, so I forced a smile, swallowed the lump in my throat, and said, "That's okay, Mom. We'll make our plans." The truth was, I never had the money for a vacation back then. I was a single mother, newly divorced, trying to keep a roof over our heads and food in the pantry. My house was a modest 2-story colonial with peeling white paint and drafty windows that needed replacing. The mortgage payments ate up most of what I made, and what was left went to utilities, groceries, and school supplies. The idea of spending a week at the beach felt like an impossible luxury, one I couldn't afford, even if I had been invited. But the sting wasn't about money. It was about belonging, or rather, not belonging. Every year it was the same. My mother's beach house in Wilmington wasn't small. It had 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and a sprawling deck that overlooked the Atlantic Ocean. There was plenty of room for my sister Olivia, her husband Mark, and their children, Anna, Ben, Claire, and Sophie. But somehow, there was never space. For me and my 2. My mother always framed it like logistics, but the truth was clear. Olivia and her brood were her favorites, and I was the one left out. I tried not to let it show, but the rejection cut deeper than I admitted, even to myself. I scrolled through photos Olivia posted on Facebook, sun-drenched mornings on the porch, barbecue dinners with cousins running barefoot in the yard, fireworks exploding above the ocean while everyone toasted with champagne. Julia would sometimes sit beside me, her small hands clutching mine, and whisper, "Why don't we ever get to go, Mom?" I would lie and say, "Because it's too crowded, sweetheart. Grandma doesn't have enough room." But inside I was angry. Angry at my mother for not trying harder to include us. Angry at Olivia for never speaking up. Angry at myself for not being able to give my kids the same memories and experiences. I wasn't completely helpless, though. I worked hard, harder than most people realized. By day, I managed freelance marketing projects for local businesses, dentists, offices, restaurants, and small boutiques that needed logos or social media pages. By night, I poured my energy into pitching bigger clients, dreaming of building an agency that could stand on its own. I used the spare bedroom as my office, cramming a desk against the wall beside boxes of old files. Some nights, I fell asleep. There, face pressed against the keyboard. The bills piled up faster than the clients came in, and there were months when I wondered if I'd have to sell the house. Still, I refused to quit. Julia and Ethan needed to see me fight, needed to know their mother wasn't going to crumble just because life hadn't been kind. Meanwhile, Olivia's life seemed to glitter effortlessly. She lived in Charlotte, in a 5-bedroom brick home with manicured lawns, and a husband whose job in finance paid more in bonuses than I made all year. She never missed a chance to remind me how fortunate they were, or to suggest that maybe I'd be better off getting a real job instead of chasing my little business dreams. I laughed it off, but her words sank deep. Even my mother, in her quiet way, hinted that maybe I wasn't practical enough. "You've always been the dreamer, Amelia," she'd say. "Olivia's the steady one. 8 years is a long time to be excluded, but that's how long it went on. 8 summers of excuses, 8 years of watching my children's disappointment. I tried to make the best of it. We camped in the backyard with a tent and flashlights. We spent afternoons at the public pool, where the smell of chlorine clung to our hair for days. In good years, I scraped together enough for a weekend in the Smoky Mountains, where we hiked trails and roasted marshmallows over a fire pit. My kids pretended it was just as fun, but I saw the longing in their eyes when they talked about the beach. The hardest part was not just the rejection, but the message it sent. I could handle being overlooked, but seeing Julia and Ethan treated as if they were less, that was unbearable. They were good kids. Julia, with her love of books and her quiet, thoughtful questions. Ethan, with his boundless energy and goofy jokes that made me laugh even on the hardest days. They deserved more than hand-me-down vacations and being left out of family traditions. By the 5th summer, the resentment had settled into my bones. I stopped answering Olivia's calls and let Mom's invitations, if they could be called that, go straight to voicemail. She always phrased it the same way. "Honey, I wish we could include you, but..." There was always a but. And after a while, I stopped waiting for it to change. Instead, I channeled that hurt into determination. Every late night at my desk, every client meeting, every rejection email became fuel. If I couldn't give my children a seat at my mother's table, then I would build a table of my own. Looking back now, I see that those years of exclusion shaped me. They forced me to stop measuring myself by my mother's approval or Olivia's polished image. They taught me to keep going even when no one believed in me. At the time, though, all I felt was exhaustion and doubt. There were nights when I stared at my bank account, seeing less than $500 left after paying bills, and wondered if I should just give up. But then Julia would come in with her spelling, homework, or Ethan would crawl into my lap asking me to read him Goodnight Moon, and I knew I couldn't. I had to prove to them, and maybe to myself, that I was capable of more. The summer of the 8th year was the turning point. Julia was 12 by then, Ethan 9. They no longer asked why we weren't invited. They already knew. That hurt more than the questions ever had. Seeing the quiet acceptance in their eyes, the way they shrugged as if to say, "That's just how it is," broke something inside me. That was the year I made a silent promise. I promised myself that we would never again wait for an invitation that wasn't coming. I promised that one day, I would create a place where my children felt they belonged, not out of pity, but because it was ours. I didn't know then how I'd make it happen, or how long it would take. All I had was a small business barely hanging on a mountain of bills, and a determination that burned hotter than any summer sun. But sometimes, determination is enough. Looking back, those exclusion years were painful, but they planted the seed of everything that came after. They pushed me past the limits of what I thought I could endure, and they lit the fire that would one day transform not only my life, but my children's as well. At the time, though, I only knew one thing for certain. If I wanted my kids to have a place in this world, I would have to build it myself. After those years of exclusion, I came to realize that bitterness alone would never change my life. I could either stay resentful, watching from the sidelines as my sister and her family lived out the golden summers I once dreamed of, or I could build something that belonged to me and my children. That realization did not come overnight. It came in the quiet hours, late at night, when Julia and Ethan were asleep, and I sat in my cramped home office staring at spreadsheets and half-finished marketing proposals. Work became my anchor. It was the one thing I could control when everything else felt uncertain. I didn't have the security of Olivia's husband's financial job or the backing of family money. All I had was grit, determination, and the small seed of an idea that I could create an agency from nothing. In the beginning, my clients were small and scattered. My very first long-term client was a bakery in Charlotte, a tiny family-owned place that wanted a social media presence. They paid me $600 a month to run their Facebook and Instagram, and to me, it felt like winning the lottery. Every time I saw one of their posts go viral in the local community, I felt a rush of pride. It wasn't just about money, it was proof that I had value, that I could help businesses grow. From there, doors began to open, slowly at first, then faster. I picked up a contract with a law firm in Atlanta. They needed branding and a new website, and the $5,000 they paid me for the project felt astronomical at the time. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that night, staring at the check, my hands trembling. I deposited it the next morning, and when I saw my bank balance climb high enough to cover bills without fear, I cried. The turning point, however, came with the hotel chain in New York. It was a fluke. I had pitched to their regional office countless times with no response. And then one day, out of the blue, an email landed in my inbox. "We'd like to schedule a call to discuss your proposal." That single line changed the trajectory of my life. The negotiations took weeks. I stayed up night after night, researching, preparing presentations, rehearsing my pitch until my voice went hoarse. When the deal finally closed, they signed me for a year-long contract worth $85,000. It was more money than I had ever earned in my life, and when the first installment hit my account, I sat at my desk in shock, hands covering my mouth. I didn't splurge. Instead, I reinvested almost all of it into my business. I hired 2 part-time employees to help with design and copywriting. I upgraded my office equipment and rented a small downtown workspace so I could meet clients in a professional environment. For the first time, I felt like a real business owner, not just a woman trying to hustle her way out of debt. Within 2 years, my agency's revenue crossed $600,000 annually. I went from juggling bills and counting pennies at the grocery store to finally breathing without fear of overdraft notices. With that financial stability, I made a choice I had dreamed of for years. I bought a home for my children and me. It was a 5-bedroom colonial in Raleigh, painted crisp white with black, shutters and a wide front porch. The backyard stretched into a gentle slope where Julia and Ethan could run freely without worrying about cars or neighbors. When we moved in, I watched them race through the house, their voices echoing off the walls, and I thought to myself, this is what stability feels like. No more rent notices, no more fear of eviction, just home. But as much as that house felt like a dream come true, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that my true dream was still waiting for me. I wanted something bigger. Something that would prove not just to my family but to myself that I was more than the forgotten daughter, more than the sister who never had enough. That opportunity came during a business trip to Florida. I had traveled to Jacksonville to meet a potential client, and while driving back to my hotel, I passed a worn-down beachfront inn. The paint was chipped and peeling, the roof sagged in places, and the vacancy sign flickered half-dead. Most tourists probably ignored it, but something about that building caught my eye. On impulse, I pulled over. I walked through the property, the sand crunching under my shoes, and I could almost see what it could be. Ocean view suites with floor-to-ceiling windows, a rooftop deck where lanterns glowed against the night sky, and families gathering on the beach below. I saw life, joy, belonging, the very things I had been denied for years. It took weeks of negotiations and several sleepless nights before I signed the papers. The purchase price was $1.2 million, and the renovations cost another $800,000. It was a risk, an enormous one. But when I looked at the numbers, I knew I could make it work. I had the client base, the revenue streams, and most importantly, the determination. Renovation became my obsession. I poured my soul into every detail, from choosing the tile in the bathrooms to hand-picking the lanterns that would light the rooftop deck. Julia and Ethan came with me often, running down the half-finished hallways, their laughter echoing off freshly painted walls. They began to call it our resort, and hearing that phrase made every late night worth it. We opened the following summer, and I named it Harbor Light Resort. The name came to me one night as I stood on the rooftop looking out at the dark ocean with a single lighthouse beam sweeping across the water. For me, the resort was more than a business. It was a symbol, a beacon that said, you belong. You are enough. You don't have to beg for a place at someone else's table. You can build your own. The first guests arrived in June, and I will never forget the pride on Julia and Ethan's faces as they helped hand out welcome drinks. To them, this wasn't just a hotel. It was the physical proof that our years of exclusion had not broken us. Instead, they had driven us here, to a place of our own. For me, Harbor Light was more than just an investment. It was the answer to 8 years of hurt. Every room I renovated, every beam I restored, every dollar I risked was my way of reclaiming the summers we had lost. It was my way of saying to my children, we are no longer outsiders. We are the hosts now. Of course, I knew my mother and Olivia would eventually hear about it. News travels fast in families, especially when there is something to gossip about. But that summer, I didn't care about their opinions. For once, I was too busy building a life that didn't revolve around waiting for their approval. Looking back, I see that chapter 2 of my life wasn't just about building a business. It was about building myself. It was about proving that I could take rejection and turn it into resilience, take exclusion and turn it into independence. Harbor Light Resort wasn't just a property, it was the embodiment of everything I had fought for every sleepless night, every tear I had shed when the phone calls came saying, there just isn't enough room. Now there was room, plenty of it. But it was mine. Ours. And for the first time in my life, I felt the true meaning of freedom. When June arrived, I already knew what was coming. It had become tradition by now, though a painful one. Like clockwork, my mother would call with her annual excuse. The phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon while I was finalizing staff schedules for Harbor Light Resort. I glanced at the screen, saw her name, and almost laughed. I answered anyway, leaning back in my chair, ready to hear the script I knew by heart. "Sweetheart," she began in that sing-song tone she always used. "I'm so sorry, but your sister's bringing the kids again this year. You understand how it is. 4 children, Mark, and of course all their things. The house just fills up. There isn't enough room." For years, those words had pierced me like knives. This time, though, I smiled. I let her finish, and then I said calmly, "That's all right, Mom. I already have plans." She hesitated, caught off guard. "Oh? What kind of plans?" "Oh, nothing to worry about," I answered, keeping my voice steady. "We'll be just fine." I hung up before she could dig for more, and for the first time in nearly a decade, I didn't feel the crushing weight of being excluded. Instead, I felt a giddy thrill, because this time I was the one holding all the cards. That summer, I decided to create the family vacation my children had been denied for so long. Not in Wilmington at my mother's beach house, but here, at Harbor Light Resort. And not with the people who had overlooked us, but with those who had shown us kindness when we were invisible. I started with Aunt Caroline, my mother's younger sister. She had always been gentle with Julia and Ethan, sending them birthday cards even when others forgot, slipping me a $20 bill here and there when she knew I was struggling. She said yes immediately. Next was my cousin Rebecca, who lived in Virginia, and had 2 children of her own. Rebecca and I had always been close, even though life had pulled us in different directions. She sounded delighted when I invited her, promising to drive down with her kids. Then I extended invitations to a few close friends, the ones who had watched my children when I had late client meetings, who had shown up at school recitals when my mother never did, who had treated Julia and Ethan like part of their families. Every single one of them said yes. The day of arrival came, and I stood on the front steps of Harbor Light as the first cars pulled up. Aunt Caroline's sedan, Rebecca's SUV, my friends' minivans, it felt like a parade of loyalty pulling into the driveway. Julia and Ethan ran to greet everyone, their excitement spilling over like soda from a shaken can. One by one, guests stepped out of their vehicles and stopped, their eyes widening as they took in the resort. The white stucco walls gleamed in the sun, fresh paint glistening. The private boardwalk stretched from the property directly to the sand, where waves lapped lazily against the shore. The infinity pool sparkled like liquid glass, its edge vanishing into the endless horizon of the Atlantic. The gardens I had planted were in full bloom, splashes of pink, purple, and yellow lining the walkways. "My goodness," Aunt Caroline whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Amelia, it's breathtaking." Rebecca hugged me tightly, then stepped back to look around. "You built this? With your own business? I knew you were doing well, but I had no idea it was like this." I laughed, a little shy, but inside I was glowing. For years, I had been seen as the struggling one, the sister who hadn't made it. Now, standing in front of this place I had built from the ground up, I finally felt like my work spoke for itself. That evening, after everyone had settled into their suites, we gathered on the rooftop deck. Strings of warm lanterns crisscrossed above us, casting golden light across the tables. Platters of food lined the buffet, fresh seafood, roasted vegetables, fruit, and bread I had arranged from a local caterer. A live band played soft jazz in the corner. Julia and Ethan darted among the guests, carrying trays of lemonade and sweet tea, their faces flushed with pride. At one point, Ethan tugged at my sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, leaning close. "This feels like a real family vacation. Our vacation." Those words nearly undid me. I had to blink back tears as I pulled him close. For the first time, my children were not looking in from the outside. They were at the heart of it, surrounded by love and laughter, finally experiencing what they had been denied. We toasted on that deck as the sun set, streaks of orange and pink bleeding into the ocean. Glasses clinked, laughter rang out, and for the first time in years, I felt whole. No resentment, no aching emptiness. Just joy. Of course, word traveled. Fast. It always does. By the third day, I received a call from Olivia. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Her voice was sharp, already edged with anger. "Why didn't you invite us? Mom told me you were hosting a vacation at some resort. Why didn't you call me?" I took a breath, savoring the moment. "Because there wasn't enough room," I said simply, echoing the line that had been used against me year after year. The silence on the other end was delicious. Finally, she snapped, "That's ridiculous. You know we would have come. You're being childish, Amelia." "Funny," I replied. "That's exactly what I thought all those summers you left us out." And then I ended the call. Later, I noticed a voicemail from my mother. Her tone was dripping with guilt, carefully rehearsed. "Sweetheart, I wish you had told me you were planning something like this. You should have invited us. After all, we're family. I don't understand why you'd exclude us. We could have made room somehow. Please think about it." But I didn't call her back. For once, I didn't feel the need to explain myself or apologize for her hurt feelings. Instead, I let her sit, with the same words she had thrown at me for 8 years. There isn't enough room. The week at Harbor Light went on without them, and it was one of the happiest times of my life. Julia and Ethan swam every morning, played volleyball in the afternoons, and built sandcastles with their cousins until the sun dipped low. Evenings were filled with music, stories, and bonfires on the beach. At night, I would sit on the balcony, listening to the waves crash against the shore, and think, this is what family is supposed to feel like. By the time everyone left, I felt a shift inside me. It wasn't just about proving my mother or sister wrong. It was about proving to myself that I could create a space where love, support, and belonging thrived. For the first time, I realized I didn't need their approval. I didn't need to be invited into their world. I had built my own, and it was better than anything they had offered. That summer changed everything. It was the first time my children experienced inclusion instead of exclusion. It was the first time extended relatives saw me as more than the struggling sister. It was the first time I truly understood the power of standing on my own. And as for my mother and Olivia, they could stew in their disappointment. I had no intention of opening the door for them again, not after they had slammed it in my face for so many years. That was the summer of my own. The summer I stopped waiting for a place at someone else's table and built one of my own, big enough for everyone who had ever shown me kindness, and deliberately closed to those who hadn't. And I will never forget the peace that came with that choice. The summer at Harbor Light changed more than just our vacation plans. It shifted the balance of my entire life. Something invisible but powerful broke that year. The old cycle of waiting for permission, waiting for inclusion, waiting for crumbs from a table that was never meant for me. And once it broke, I never wanted to go back. Word spread quickly about what I had done. The family who once barely remembered my children's birthdays began calling, their voices dripping with curiosity and admiration. Some congratulated me. Sincerely, others with thinly veiled envy, but the pattern was clear. They could no longer pretend I was the forgotten one. I had built something that demanded to be noticed, but what mattered more than their reactions was the change I saw in my children. Julia walked taller, her shoulders squared with pride as she told her friends, "My mom owns a resort." Ethan's laughter carried farther than it ever had before, his eyes shining when he introduced himself to guests as if he were part of the staff. They no longer carried the quiet shame of being left out. They were included, not because someone made room for them, but because I had created the room myself. That first summer became a tradition. Every year, I invited the same circle of relatives and friends who had stood by us during the hardest times. Harbor Light is filled with love, laughter, and loyalty. There were no whispered comparisons, no careful balancing of favoritism. Everyone was welcome. Everyone belonged. And each time I watched my children dive into the ocean or fall, asleep tired and sun-kissed after long days of play, I knew I had given them more than just vacations. I had given them dignity. Still, I wasn't finished. My business was thriving, and with the resort running successfully, new doors began to open. Within 2 years, I had the opportunity to purchase a second property, a historic beachfront hotel in Charleston, South Carolina. The asking price was $2.5 million, a number that once would have seemed unreachable. But thanks to Harbor Light's profits and the growth of my marketing agency, it was possible. I threw myself into that project with the same intensity I had given the first. The Charleston property had a faded elegance with tall windows and wrought iron balconies overlooking cobblestone streets. I restored its charm piece by piece, turning it into a boutique-style resort that attracted guests from across the country. When it reopened, fully booked for the summer season, I realized something extraordinary. I was no longer chasing stability. I was creating abundance. The third expansion came 3 years later, this time in the Florida Keys. That purchase cost nearly doubled the Charleston project, close to $5 million. It was risky, yes, but by then I had a team of trusted managers and a steady stream of investors eager to partner with me. I poured my vision into it, a luxury resort with private bungalows, a spa, and a restaurant where guests could dine while waves lapped at the shore. When it opened, it was not just successful. It was celebrated. Travel magazines featured it, bloggers wrote about it, and my name became quietly respected in hospitality circles. By then, annual profits exceeded $3 million. For the first time in my life, I could breathe without fear. The money gave me freedom, but more importantly, it gave me peace. I no longer stayed awake at night wondering how to stretch $500 into a month's worth of bills. I no longer held my breath when answering the phone, afraid it might be a debt collector. Those days were behind me, replaced by board meetings, design consultations, and vacations I planned, not because I was desperate for inclusion, but because I wanted to celebrate life with the people who mattered. Of course, success doesn't erase the past, and eventually, my mother and Olivia tried to step back into my world. It happened at the grand opening of my third resort in the Keys. The event had been planned meticulously. Press coverage, ribbon cutting, champagne flowing. Julia, now 17, looked stunning in a pale blue dress, standing beside me with Ethan, who was 14 and already taller than me. I was giving interviews, basking in the joy of the moment when I saw them, my mother and Olivia. They had not been invited, yet there they were, dressed as if they belonged. Mom's smile stretched too wide as she hurried over, her arms open. "Sweetheart, oh, this is magnificent. I can't believe you've built all this." Her hug was tight, almost desperate, as though she could squeeze her way back into relevance. Olivia followed, equally polished in a designer dress, her tone casual, as though the years of exclusion had never happened. "Amelia, you've outdone yourself. We should have worked together sooner. I can imagine all sorts of ways our families could combine forces." I listened politely, my face calm, my heart steady. But inside, there was no warmth. They were not here to celebrate me. They were here because they could no longer deny me. For years, I had begged for their scraps of attention, their acknowledgement, their approval. But standing there, surrounded by guests who had supported me with my children by my side, I realized something important. I didn't need them. Not anymore. So I smiled, offered them champagne, and let them mingle. I was civil, but I was unmoved. Their attempts at reconciliation were too little, too late. My forgiveness was not theirs to demand. The truth was simple. I had built my life without them, and it was stronger, brighter, and freer than anything they had ever offered me. I didn't hate them. I no longer had the energy for that, but I didn't need them either. And that, I think, was what unsettled them most. Over time, they tried again. Calls on holidays, messages about family gatherings, invitations that felt more like obligations. But I kept my boundaries. I was no longer willing to shrink myself to fit their definition of family. I had my own family, I learned, is not about bloodlines. It is not about who shares your last name or who lives under the same roof. Family is about who shows up when it matters, who believes in you when you have nothing to offer in return, who holds your hand through the storm instead of closing the door. By that definition, my family was clear. Julia and Ethan, of course, but also Aunt Caroline, Cousin Rebecca, and the friends who had stood by me when no one else did. Every time I walked the beaches near my resorts, feeling the sand between my toes and hearing the crash of waves against the shore, I thought about how far we had come. The ocean, once a symbol of rejection and exclusion, now represented independence, dignity, and triumph. It no longer mocked me with what I couldn't have. Instead, it reminded me of everything I had claimed with my own two hands. That final shift, choosing respect and independence over desperation and scraps, was the most important transformation of all. Because in the end, it wasn't just about building resorts or making millions. It was about building a life where my children knew their worth, where I knew my own, and where the table we sat at was filled not with obligation, but with love. And that more than anything is what I count as success.